Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. First and foremost, just to welcome you here to ALDE headquarters, just to discuss some issues very pertinent at the moment due to the pharmaceutical strategy being debated elsewhere in the Parliament and the Council. My name is Billy Kelleher MEP, or a Renew MEP for the constituency of Ireland South. And I suppose I take an active interest in pharmaceuticals, the pharmaceutical sector, and the technologies that are, evolving because of just a huge investment in innovation and research that is happening across the globe. And of course, we want to make sure that Ireland and Europe is a part of that as well. So we really have to get the pharmaceutical strategy right for two reasons. Number one, we want to have certainty for industry on policy, so they can look into the future. They can then start to invest in new medicines and new technologies to bring them to market at some stage. And of course, the upside of that, from my perspective as a public representative, is to ensure that the best medicines are being made available to citizens of Europe. So it's really that dynamic is what motivates me. And I know that the industry is very excited about the potentials that are out there in terms of the advances in science and medical science. I suppose the creativity that's coming out of our academic institutes, linking that in with industry to bring forward medicines. And then the European Medicines Agency and others, trying to ensure that medicines are approved quickly, but there's full assessment made, and then that we start to roll out medicines to the people that need them. And of course, for that to happen, there has to be a timely reimbursement and a streamlined reimbursement process. And of course, we're not there yet by any manner of means. If you look across Europe, there's huge variations in terms of the time between a medicine being approved and it being approved for reimbursement. And I don't think it's acceptable that we have a situation where European citizens have access to medicines based on where they were born. It simply, to me, is undermining the concept of solidarity and cohesiveness of a European Union and rights conferred on citizens by the fact that they are citizens of Europe. So that's my opening point. So if I was to look into the future in terms of the pharmaceutical industry and the life sciences, medical devices, and if we don't change where we are in Europe, we're going to be left behind. And that means our industry will be left behind, but more importantly, our citizens that need access to high-end medicines will be left behind as well. If you look at the number of clinical trials being conducted in Ireland and across Europe, vis-a-vis elsewhere, in the United States particularly, but also now in Asia as well, they really are coming to the fore. And I just think we have to really step up. So the pharmaceutical strategy is one part of it, but we really have to stimulate research and innovation, and of course that is down to member states, sometimes also the European Union in terms of taxation policies, investment in academic research, investment in third level institutes, and stimulating interest in the sciences as well, and STEM in terms of attracting people into those particular academic courses in the first place. So we have two speakers here today, Elisabeth Dupont, who is the European Regional Manager for International Diabetes Federation, and David Talbot, the Associate Vice President of International Government with Eli Lilly. So I'm going to now call on, is it Elisabeth first? It is, yeah, it is Elisabeth. Elisabeth. Over to Elisabeth. It's automatic.
It's work? Okay. Thank you very much. I'm Elisabeth Dupont. I'm the IDF Europe Region Manager, as I've just been said. IDF Europe stands for 73 Diabetes Association, and we are present in 43 countries across Europe. And today is a very special day for the diabetes community, so I would like to thank ALDE for hosting us and for the interest on diabetes today, because it's World Diabetes Day. So that means that across the world, the diabetes community is raising awareness about the importance of that underestimated condition. I know that the topic today is the pharma strategy, and I think it's very, very appropriate in terms of the impact it can have on the diabetes community, but obviously on all conditions, and more specifically also on non-communicable diseases. why is it so important to highlight diabetes in this context? We feel that there are still a number of huge unmet medical needs. Diabetes is a condition that seems to be well known, but it's very badly understood. It's a condition that people think most of the time people bring on themselves. They are responsible for it because they don't have a good lifestyle, they don't do enough physical activity, etc. But that doesn't take into consideration all the other risk factors that are not modifiable, such as genetics, age, ethnicity, etc. So we feel that too often policymakers and healthcare systems feel that diabetes is under control because everyone knows about it, but still there is 1 out of 10 people who live with diabetes. There is also an increasing number of people living with the condition. And interestingly enough, out of the 4 major NCDs, diabetes is the only condition for which premature death is still increasing, which is something that is often forgotten. And as a patient representative, I really don't understand why diabetes is not prioritized and why we always feel that we have to look at mortality and not at the cause of a condition. We all know that diabetes is the main risk factor for cardiovascular disease, kidney disease, a number of other life-threatening complications. It's the first cause of blindness, etc. And still, diabetes is not prioritized. This amazes me, and I feel there is a huge paradox here that can be addressed by a good understanding of the condition and making sure that the patient is heard. And that's probably my main message in terms of the pharma strategy and in terms of how we can improve the current strategy, is to make sure that patients are engaged at all stage of the development of the process, starting from early research up to the definition of unmet medical needs, to also the role of patients in the EMA structure and the new revision of the EMA process, and a number of topics where proper engagement with people living with the condition, being diabetes, but obviously any other condition, would be critical.
Thank you very much, Elisabeth. Now I'll hand over to David Talbot, Associate Vice President of International Government with Eli Lilly. Sorry, my apologies. I now hand over to David Talbot, Associate Vice President, International Government with Eli Lilly. Of course, Eli Lilly is a very successful company, and we appreciate your support here today, David. And also, if you're in Ireland, you are bound to see a major footprint of Eli Lilly, in the sense that they have huge investment right across the entire country. So from a very parochial perspective, David, I welcome you to the stage as well. So over to you.
Yeah, much appreciated, and thank you for Alde for hosting this event. Terrific to be here. Always a pleasure to be in Brussels as well. A little bit more about Lilly. We've been in Europe for more than 80 years. In fact, I was just in Toronto 2 weeks ago, where we were celebrating the 100th anniversary of the first commercial production of insulin, which Lilly partnered with the University in Toronto about. So honored to be here sharing the stage with you on such an important day. In addition to that, in addition to our presence in Ireland, we have about 9,000 employees here in Europe, including at other major sites in Italy and Spain and France, and a lot of clinical research, a lot of research and development. As a company, we're growing a great deal. And so the pharma strategy is particularly important to us, and what direction Europe decides to go in. We see this as a bit of a crossroads. Can we return to the past when Europe was, the medicine chest of the world? 20 years ago, 1 out of every 2 medicines were developed here in Europe. Today, that's 1 in 5. And if you look at the trend line over the last 20 years, the amount of research and development is declining in Europe as a share of the rest of the world. So it's a very competitive global environment. And I think the pharmaceutical strategy and associated legislation is an opportunity to reverse that trend. The question is, in the draft that was originally released, would the goals that the Commission had set out in that way be addressed? And I think we would argue there are a number of elements of that which are well-intentioned, in particular trying to even out access across all of the 27 member states. We share that goal with the Commission, but not necessarily the approach that was taken in the original draft of the legislation. There are also a number of elements which are, I think positive from a regulatory standpoint, but are they ambitious enough? I think the gold standard in terms of regulatory efficiency is the Food and Drug Administration in the United States. And even the goal of improving the EMA's processes is only going to get Europe part of the way to speeding things forward. And as Elisabeth talks about, I think diabetes is a great example in this way. We've come a long way in 100 years to treating diabetes. I think it is confusing to many of us as to why it isn't considered more of a threat, but the economic impact of a disease like diabetes is enormous. And how do you address that? In many ways, some of the medical interventions that we now have and the technology associated with those is incredible. But the application of that across the European systems is very uneven. The question is, whose responsibility is that? And I think the legislation attempts to address that in a couple of ways. One is a philosophical approach saying that, if we decrease intellectual property protection, we're going to increase access. As an industry, we don't agree that that is the case. We believe that barriers to access are across different decision-making bodies. And as an industry, we've made a commitment to filing in all 27 member states within 2 years of EMA approval. But that is only part of the way to getting medicines in to the systems. And we need to identify collectively as all sorts of stakeholders, whether they be government, whether it be Europe writ large, whether it be patient organizations, whether it be industry, whether it be medical societies and professionals, and politicians at the local level, as well as to how we are going to address the reasons why a given patient in a given geography doesn't have access to the newest treatments. And I think the legislation, as it was originally drafted, does place a lot of that responsibility on the industry. And what we're trying to demonstrate is that we can make certain commitments in order to attempt to address that challenge, but there's only so much the industry can actually do in that way. And so we need to work together to identify what the reasons, once we do that filing, what happens afterwards. What healthcare budget is actually dedicated to pharmaceuticals? How quick is that reimbursement process? How restrictive are the rules of reimbursement in any given member state? And I think we need to recognize and acknowledge that these sorts of decisions are member state competencies. And those governments have a very different approach to how they fund healthcare as well. And so I think it's an honest conversation that actually has to be had. If you come from outside of Europe and you look at the avalanche of change that is coming our way, whether it be this piece of legislation, whether it be on a couple of pieces of legislation and regulation regarding intellectual property, whether it be environmental regulation, whether it be a number of other standards that are being considered, it is challenging as someone who advocates within my company to make sure that investment is considered for the European environment, to make the case that this is a stable place to invest. We have a long-standing commitment here. Europe is an incredibly important commercial environment for us. It's important scientifically. It's important because we have major facilities here that we've invested in. We've announced recent investments and increases in a lot of different places. However, what shares Europe is going to get of what the future investments of companies like ours that are growing. And I think that's the question that we need to ask about whether the legislation is addressing all of those needs from a competitiveness standpoint and addressing that access, and making sure that we're having an honest conversation about what it is that is preventing the newest innovations from getting to patients all across Europe. So I will stop there, but in general, I think this is a pivotal time, and I think that discussion needs to be had. We need to have an honest conversation with those making decisions about where research and investment in our sector is put. And if we are not appealing to that through this legislation in a balanced way, then we're probably not meeting the goals.
Okay. Thank you very much, David. Elisabeth, first to you. Today is International Diabetes Day, the 14th of November. One thing that concerns me a lot about when we're talking about the pharmaceutical strategy, when we're just talking about medicine and the availability of medicines in general, sometimes we fail at the first hurdle in terms of diagnosis, and concentrating on firstly finding out the health status of populations. And I just think from the point of view of diagnosis, do you think there's more we can do in the area of diabetes, for example, to diagnose very early on? I still, even at this stage, I'm 55 years of age. Some of my friends have been diagnosed with it, but it was because of the fact that there was health complications that were diagnosed elsewhere. So I'm just wondering, is there an emphasis need to be put on the diagnostic side of things as well when we talk about pharmaceutical strategies?
Yeah, I think this is an excellent question, and I think you have it fully right. Diagnosis is a huge issue for people living with diabetes and for the community at large, because there are about 35% of people living with diabetes who do not know they have diabetes. And you also know that if you live with high blood glucose levels for a long time, you end up with complications that at some point are no longer reversible. So early diagnosis is key to avoid and possibly prevent diabetes. But if you don't prevent diabetes, to certainly prevent the longer term complications that are the ones that are so expensive for health budgets. So again, having a very early action would make sense for everyone, for the patient, for healthcare professionals, for policymakers, for health systems. And you were saying, what can we do? Obviously, we support early diagnosis of high-risk patients, but there are quite a number of current innovation that are on their way, and that we really need to take advantage of, either for type 1 diabetes or for type 2 diabetes. So for type 1, which is an autoimmune disease, there is currently a possibility to, and I think it has been approved by the FDA, because you were mentioning how quickly they work compared to Europe, to possibly prevent the onset of type 1 diabetes for up to 3 years. It may seem only 3 years, but it's huge for a person who will be living with the condition for 50, 70 years. For type 2 diabetes, we often think only about lifestyle measures. These are essential. Obviously, these have to be taken into consideration, but there are now a number of new medications that are really critical to help people preventing diabetes. So we know about the GLP-1s, for example. We know that for people, losing weight is something extremely difficult. And if they don't get the support, the psychological support, the support from their GP, in terms of understanding the health environment they are living in, but also the medication that can help to treat them as early as possible so that they don't develop the complication. And I think your question about aging is critical. We should have health checks where people, are regularly checked for diabetes and high level glucose. So yeah, early diagnosis, early action are critical for people living with diabetes.
And just, is there any one country in the European Union that, stands out as being very progressive and having good policies in place around diagnostics for diabetes, or are we all sort of similar in not having, good diagnostic systems in place for diabetes? Is there any one country that sort of sticks out in your mind as being a good role model, should we say?
I think it depends on whether you think about type 1 or type 2. In terms of type 1, we know that Italy has been a pioneer in adopting a new prevention law for type 1 diabetes, which is unheard across Europe. For type 2 diabetes, these are more local and regional initiatives. We know that in the UK, for example, they have a number of excellent pilots, but these are very localized. So there is a need to, again, harmonize the approach across Europe.
Thank you, Elisabeth. David, you referred to a couple of points there, and I can look at, the point you made with a number of hats, or historical hats at the very least. I mean, I can remember a time when, trying to get a medicine available that had been approved by the regulatory authorities, but getting it approved for reimbursement, effectively having to get patients and patient advocacy groups to stand outside the Parliament in Ireland at all, in the rain, campaigning for Reprisa, for example, cystic fibrosis medicine. The consistent campaigning that's required to make medicines available. So I suppose the issue really here is governments of all, ideological views or no ideological view, like to keep the control of their budget within their own parameters. And of course, the difficulty here is if we're asking companies that have an innovative medicine to file in all 27 member states, of course, if the 27 member states have very disparate methods of assessment and approval, well, then it could actually delay the process, it could tie up the process, and it could, in my view, unwind what we want to do, which is to have rapid approval from EMA approval and then rapid approval for reimbursement. So where do you see it? Where do you see into the slight future? Where would you like to see the pharmaceutical strategy land that's fair to yourselves as the industry that is bringing forward the innovative medicines, but equally fair to taxpayers that fund these medicines, and most importantly, fair to those that need them?
Well, I mean, this is not a new problem, right? And I think the challenge that we have across the board is the variation between when a medicine is available, if it ever is available, to a patient in one country versus another can vary by years. And in many of these markets, what the EMA approves, the percentage of those medicines that actually become available is very low. And I think that needs to be acknowledged. I think the financial impact of the pandemic is going to be with us for a long time. But again, it's not a new challenge. We have seen across almost all publicly funded healthcare systems a struggle to balance between where you're going to make investments. But I want to go back to a point that Elisabeth raised. What is very difficult for finance ministers to account for is if you treat a disease like diabetes and you diagnose it early enough, you avoid longer term, more expensive interventions, whether they be surgical or other healthcare complications. And I think we need to work together with all of the data that's now at our disposal to demonstrate that. And that's innovative, different pricing models. That's a way of trying to make sure that there is value associated with, the outcomes of innovative medicine use. And I think we've seen some experiments on that front. It is very difficult for smaller health ministries in particular to manage these sorts of agreements with the industry. So I think we need to try and simplify and find better models. But I think also governments need to invest in healthcare. And, we talked about the variation in how long it takes to get to medicine. It's not an exact corollary, but, there are some governments in Europe that spend a very small percentage of their GDP on healthcare. And I think their patients are often the ones who wait the longest. And I think that that needs to be examined as well. And, you know, one of the things that we've done as an industry in order to demonstrate why it is that there are longer delays in some places than others is created a portal which allows people to understand when we filed and when access was actually granted in those markets, so that we can actually have effect-based discussions about where the responsibility lies for, you know, making sure that innovation gets to as many people as possible. You know, I think it is important to remember that this, you know, we're in a system where 27 member states have 27 different healthcare systems. And I know that there is a desire to make as much of that similar as possible. But we have to give member states the autonomy as well to make the decisions and make their own financial decisions about how they want to invest. However, that does run contrary to an idea of equity across all of the 27 member states, and especially when that divergent investment levels in your healthcare system makes those decisions very difficult. We're willing to be a partner in that because we share that goal of trying to get as much access as possible. It's a complicated pricing environment in Europe because of parallel trade and the common market and people in different governments referencing prices. There's different economic levels across Europe. You know, it is very complex. But that being said, you know, I think we've made very public commitments as an industry to do what we believe is the right thing. But the steps beyond that are further discussions. What I don't think is wise, especially for many in Brussels here and across Europe who want to encourage the competitiveness of the sector, is to be punitive about intellectual property in the context of access. Separating those two, I think, is very important. We've seen that in the rapporteur's report, which I think was an important signal that there is a recognition that maybe those two things aren't associated. We can still talk about access. We can still talk about doing that more quickly than the implementation of this legislation. But let's look at what the real barriers are and then try and address them together.
Okay. Thank you, David. Any questions from the audience? Yes, indeed.
Thanks a lot. My name is Elisabeth from Working Consulting. You mentioned the barriers to access, and you also mentioned that you are making efforts being more visible and transparent towards the audience. And I was wondering, sorry. Thank you so much. You mentioned, David, that you are making huge efforts about being more transparent, providing more information, and I was wondering if you also make an effort to explain in a publicly available place what could be the solutions and where others can help. Because to me it seems, and I've been following this conversation through many conferences, and it seems that all the solutions and efforts is pushed towards the industry. And I believe there could be some solutions where other can support, and probably there are low-hanging fruits. So I was wondering if there is an analysis or you've been thinking about how to create a conversation to identify low-hanging fruits.
Lots. I think and thank you for the question, Elisabeth. I do think the overall challenge is we often in healthcare have an emotional debate about these sorts of issues when in many ways we're not talking from the same fact base. And so I think it's important that we are able to measure progress. We're able to measure apples to apples as best we can, and we are able to have an honest conversation about why one patient in one country or even a region within that country has access and one does not. And so there are a couple of tools that the industry has created. One is something that we publish every year, which is called the WAIT indicator, which shows how long after EMA approval it takes to get access on average to different therapeutic areas across Europe. I think that's a helpful discussion. we often get into the technical details about whether people believe that data is correct or not. I think that's probably not the most useful debate. It's more about what are the trend lines, what do we know about those systems, and how that they do treat innovation. And I think, obviously looking at the investment levels across health is important. And this portal that I mentioned, which talks a little bit about what those barriers are. And it's not just reimbursement that decision making delays. It's health technology assessment. It's label. It's restrictions on certain types of prescribing. It's limited patient populations. It's limiting which physicians can actually prescribe what. In environments where you have limited number of specialists and they're the only ones who are allowed to prescribe certain types of medication, particularly in diabetes, this is a problem we know. So I think that there's enough facts out there to have an actual discussion about the real barriers. But I think that involves a level of health policy expertise that is, I think, challenging for particular MEPs who have a lot of different subjects to take on right now. And so that's why these sorts of discussions are important. That's why dialogue is important. That is why education of all sorts of stakeholders in the process about different perspectives is important. Because this legislation, is a game changer. And depending on which direction it goes, will send Europe in one direction or the other. And I think it deserves the scrutiny and debate that is necessary. I think rushing it through could mean we make decisions that we regret going forward, but also see it as an opportunity. So again, I think more data is important, but data that's accessible, that can actually act as the basis of a rational conversation about what it is that we need to do to improve outcomes, to diagnose, to make systems more equal across Europe, and that's going to involve everyone involved in the process.
No, just a quick, so that I think what we also need is more trust between all stakeholders, and make sure that, this trust is really what drives the dialogue and the discussion to improve the quality of life of people living with any condition. I think it's, if you have that objective in mind, and you have the trust, you can achieve a lot. So just
any other questions? Yes.
Thank you. Thank you all for the very interesting contributions. I'm Marianna. So I had a question for all of you, actually, so you can pick it up. I was wondering, during these discussions in Brussels about the revision, I heard Rapporteur Weiss saying that unmet medical need is a semantic conditionality, which I found a very interesting way to describe it. So I was wondering how this very, still I would say, not adequately defined conditionality can impact patients, but also, investors when deciding if Europe is still attractive enough.
Thank you very much, and thank you, because I believe that's probably from the patient perspective the most important question is the definition of unmet medical needs, and making sure that patients are truly engaged in drafting that definition. Obviously, from the perspective of people living with diabetes in the diabetes community, we are not happy with the definition at all. It's way too narrow. It doesn't take into consideration the fact that a lot of chronic conditions, are progressive. So what you need when you are diagnosed is not what you need 5 years later, 10 years later, etc. So saying that if it needs to be a condition for which there is no treatment doesn't mean anything for a chronic condition. So it's so important to make sure that the definition is right, and that all the aspects of what the treatment can provide is taken into consideration, because obviously it's the health outcomes that matters, but also the quality of life that goes with that. It's very, very good to have very tight blood glucose levels, but if your life is miserable, it doesn't really help you as a patient. And again, as I was telling earlier, it's not that the person has to live through that for a few months. It has to be his or her entire life. So this unmet medical need definition is crucial, and I believe a lot is being discussed around it. And I think the patient community as a whole is very active in defining it much better.
I mean, what Elisabeth said, but on top of that, I think it's important to think about unmet medical need in the way that we define innovation. Innovation comes in many different forms. And I think, as Elisabeth said, I think we providers and patients would both argue that you need to have choice in terms of what treatment options you have. If you have a condition or if you are to develop a condition, one medicine is not going to do it for everyone. And so a very restrictive definition of unmet medical need does not serve any purpose as far as I'm concerned. It discourages a lot of the innovation that we see across the sector. A lot of innovation, particularly in diseases like cancer, is very incremental, but it does change your life. And under these definitions, you could say that side effects aren't important. Or that you could say that some sort of incremental change in the administration of a medicine is not important. If you ask a patient, that could mean everything. And so choice is important. That doesn't mean that everything has to be available to everyone, but we do need a wide range of options in order to get the best outcomes for people. If you only have one choice, we know pharmacologically that not all medicines work for all people. That's why we do clinical research. That's why we do clinical trials. That's why we have mounds and mounds of data. What's the point in doing that if we're going to restrict the definition of unmet medical need so exclusively? I think it's a misunderstanding of how the research and development process works. I think it's a misunderstanding of medicine. I understand what the intent behind restricting the definition is. But I think if you look at medical progress over time, it has been incremental. We very rarely have complete breakthroughs that happen on a yearly basis. I think in many diseases, we're getting to the point where we do have a lot of breakthroughs. But I think keeping the unmet medical need definition as broad as possible is going to serve patients better.
Thanks very much. I just have time for one quick question if anybody has a question. Yes.
Thank you. John Ricketts from Lilly. Just a quick question then is, how much of an opportunity do you see the forthcoming European parliamentary elections to have this debate on a wider level with the general public, and also with national governments to tackle some of these inequities in terms of time to access for patients? Thank you.
Are you directing that to the audience or to me or to the panelists? Okay. Well, look, I'll just ask Elisabeth to reply, and then David very briefly, because we are wrapping up. So just.
I believe the question was more for you.
Was it more for me? Okay. Well, if it was more for me, then I'll use the opportunity to answer your question also to wrap up as well. Yes, I mean, look, the purpose of parliamentary elections, be they national or European, is to stimulate debate in advance of the actual election itself. And primarily, I think there's now a greater awareness of the European Parliament's role in affecting change, but also in bringing forward legislative proposals, or implementing legislative proposals, I should say, that actually have an impact. And I can see that even from the Irish perspective, where traditionally the European Parliament wouldn't have been seen as much more than just, a formal debating chamber. But now it is very evident that legislation that flows from Europe must go through the Parliament as well. So I think you'll see a lot of significant debate on the major issues. Unfortunately, as you well know, when you get into the teeth of an election itself, or the heat of an election, very often they become inflamed and tensions can sort of rise. So the important issues in terms of legislative proposals might sometimes get lost. So now it's up to ourselves as politicians and national and parties nationally to ensure that we try and elevate the important issues up there. But can we keep the pharmaceutical strategy? Can we keep access to medicines as an important issue in the election? Well, I believe if you bring it down to availability of medicines to citizens, well then yes, I think very much it would be part and parcel of that debate. There's just an issue of interest that I have, and I hope that over the next number of years, if I'm around politically, is to try and advocate, and that's for a comprehensive heel prick test for every newborn in the European Union. At the moment, we talk about disparities in terms of diagnosis and availability of medicines. But if you look at the heel prick test, the neonatal test, you know, Italy is gold standard. Ireland is mid-table. There's countries way worse than us. And I'd really like to see a day where we have a gold standard benchmark for the heel prick test. I mean, we've 7,000 rare diseases in Europe, you know, so collectively they're not rare. Not every country will have the capacity to deal with every rare disease. So, I mean, if we had a full profile of the health status of newborns, you know, you can build up that database. So you can project into the future the demands that will be on healthcare in the years ahead. It will also allow for industry to have a greater insight into the potential demands in years ahead, so they can start to innovate in advance. To see, and of course with gene therapy and immunology coming to the fore right across all diseases, but in rare diseases as well, and also in cancers, that I see huge potential there. But I think the baseline would be a heel prick test across the entirety of the European Union to build up that body of data for researchers, for companies and industry to follow, and also then for governments to be able to plan into the future in terms of workforce and actual infrastructure that's required to deal with the potential demands that will be there. So that's pretty much, maybe just a reply to the heel prick test, maybe just a short, whatever.
I think having an idea of, as you point out, what the overall disease burden of a population as early as possible can do nothing but benefit. And having that data will be, as you say, helpful not only to industry, but researchers and clinicians across the globe. So you're right that there are many good examples across Europe of things like this, where one country does it incredibly well. And how do we replicate that in other places? It makes sense as far as I'm concerned.
No, thank you. And I really like the idea. I think obviously this is more something that would be of interest to people with type 1 diabetes, because we know that obviously there is some kind of family history and people who have a type 1 in the family are more likely to develop type 1. But we also know that 75% of the newly diagnosed do not have any family history. So if we could right from the start, identify this gene or whatever who makes this immune disease becoming more prevalent in a way, because we know that since COVID, for whatever reason, there are more cases of type 1 diabetes, and type 1 diabetes in Europe is we have the highest rate of type 1 diabetes. So definitely any newborn test, if applicable, would be great.
Well, thank you very much. Just finally, I'd just like to thank our two speakers, David Talbot and Elisabeth Dupont. I'd like to thank Mike Ford and his team here in ALDE. And just say that, look, ALDE is the Alliance of Liberal Democrats of Europe. It is a free market orientated party. It is an advocate for research, for innovation, for the industry to be at the cutting edge. And that's a philosophy that's very important from the point of view of ALDE. It is pro-business, but clearly, it very much has a social conscience as well. And I think that dynamic of centrist position gives us a good insight into where we want to position the pharmaceutical strategy in terms of making sure that we have both sides of this particular debate functioning in a way that benefits both sides. And that is industry, innovation, research, and then on the other side, access to medicines for those that need it. And I believe that if we get this strategy right, And if we can unleash the might that was there in terms of the pharmaceutical industry in Europe, which showed actually that during the COVID pandemic, for example, when we collectively had to look at the pharmaceutical sector and look them in the eye and say, can you respond? And when we allowed them to respond, they did so very effectively, very rapidly in terms of the researching the vaccines, but also ramping up production and making them available to citizens. So it goes to show with the right policies, right supports, right incentives, industry will respond. And then it's up to us from the democratic point of view to make sure we have governments making medicines available as quickly as possible to those that need it. So thank you, Alde. Thank you, Mike Ford and his team. And thank you as well, David and Elizabeth. Much appreciate your attendance. Thank you.
Thank you.